and other amenities. Now let's talk statistics surrounding land and housing. To help us do that, we are joined by the Statistician General Pali Lehohla in our studios in Pretoria. Ntate Lehohla, good morning, and thank you very much for your time. We've spoken to a number of people this morning, including our reporter on the ground in Cato Crest outside Durban, just on the kinds of pressures that are brought to bear on urban areas. We see a rapidly urbanizing country. How fast, first let's start there, how fast or how rapidly is South Africa urbanizing?
Well, let's take, for instance, let's take a province like Gauteng as a microcosm of urbanization, or the city of Western Cape, or the metro of Western Cape. What we see in the province of Gauteng, for instance, is 1.2 million people in Gauteng over a period of 5 years, from 2011 to 2016. We see an increase of about 1.2 million people. It's almost the whole of Northern Cape coming into Gauteng within that period of 5 years. That will put pressure and demand on housing and everything. At the same time, as we look at that, we have to look at the context in South Africa, where at least about 2 million houses have been built since 1996 to date. Some put the figure at about 4 million. Be that as it may, we have 16 million households in South Africa. And the growth rate of households in South Africa has outpaced the rate of growth of the population. In that space, we see a decline in the average household size. That is more pronounced in urban areas, and it manifests itself in the form of shack settlements, which are about 24% of housing stock in most of the urban areas. For instance, in Gauteng, the metros, 25% in the metro of Joburg, 21% in the metro of Cape Town, and of course, as Mangaung, about 15% populate as shack settlements are that. Now, there are a lot of things that are happening there in dynamics, and we should look at this from about 1994, when people from the farms actually migrated to intermediary cities. And of course, services were provided there, like electricity, water, a little bit difficult because reticulation of water is not as easy as reticulation of electricity. But those movements were very, very transient, and they further moved into bigger cities. In other instances, like we saw intermediary cities actually growing, proving that there are reversals in terms of polarization reversals to areas like Potchefstroom, Rustenburg, and so on. Of course, if we look at the Rustenburg area, we see a very huge increase in shack settlements, which are driven largely by the mining industry, as people leave mining hostels and stay out of hostels. So there are a number of drivers of urbanization pressures in South Africa, which are basically transient movements that emerged as far early as 1992, and as well as not so much transient movements, but movements into urban centers, which have always been historically that way, but compounding that polarization reversals from major cities into smaller cities.
Now,
so it's a very strong dynamic, but Gauteng bears the brunt of this.
Gauteng bearing the brunt of this, that number you're mentioning, the 1.2 million people have moved in, for instance, from outside into Gauteng. You mentioned use a very good example. It's like the population of the Northern Cape moving into Gauteng. Trend-wise, are we seeing an increase in those numbers? Should we anticipate that there's going to be more migratory movement into areas like Gauteng and surrounding the big metros like eThekwini, for example, Cape Town, Johannesburg, Tshwane, and that should we anticipate an increase in that number into the future, because it's going to put more pressure on resources?
Yes, for as long as the levels of employment or unemployment are lower in those centers than anywhere else, they will remain very attractive. And they are major centers for people who come from outside into Gauteng. For instance, 57% or 43% of the residents in Gauteng province were not born in Gauteng. I mean, it's a magnet of migration within South Africa largely, but also for people who come from outside. So we are likely to see a lot more of that happening. But what also is happening in these areas, I mean, if you look at the policy documents that advocate for densification, and if you look at the road networks that try to encourage that, but where you see a sprawling city like Johannesburg and more buildings away from these centers, particularly both Czech settlements and any other development away from this concept of densification, you see a practice at variance with policy. And some of those disjunctures increase the costs of infrastructure. And even despite the fact that there have been houses built, and housing actually outstripping by far the rate of population growth, you realize that that's going to continue to be that way. This juncture between policy and practice, I mean, that's a very serious matter, I think, that has to be thought through.
No, indeed, that's very tough. Besides cost,
including Mangaung and so on.
Yeah, besides cost, that disjuncture will be very worrying going forward. And also there's competing needs here. You've got the commercial side that is also growing, and you've got shopping centers coming up. You've got pressures on the leisure side, and housing is still a priority. And you mentioned a very important matter there of water reticulation, which is also critical for us as a very dry country, we know, going forward. So overall, from a numbers perspective, and very briefly, I mean, if you were advising the municipalities in their urban planning, you talk about this disjuncture, where would you think they should prioritize? Where should they focus on? I mean, very briefly, in your view, knowing the numbers that you know.
Well, I'm not a policy person. I only look at policy documents and look at implementation versus what the numbers say. I think if South Africa has chosen a densification policy, then there must be follow-through to build those high-rises or medium and so on, and deal decisively with the sprawling cities, because that's what creates and adds to the cost. I suppose if the policy is for densification, unless the policy space is not very clear, then we may, because densification is not a panacea. There are others who advocate sprawling, but if densification is the decision, then the follow-through must be towards densification. But what we see is a sprawling city with buildings and construction and residences coming at the margins, far away from where jobs are, and therefore increasing the costs, not only of transport, but of reticulation of water, electricity, and all those things. Because per square meter, if you don't densify, your average cost will increase, and then making the cost of business higher. And this does not only affect the people who are living in shacks or in RDP houses, but the very rich have to be provided for, probably not paying the cost of being far away from the city center, because the urban spaces, and as we know, urbanization, the rich stay far away from these meddling grounds of the city urban space. But we are seeing high rises occupied by the very rich in very but also the very rich in gated communities far away from the city spaces, and therefore straining, if they don't pay directly themselves for those, straining the budget. So there is a whole range of things that are failing to add up from a policy perspective and the practice.
Thank you very much. The views there of Statistician General Pali Lehohla about the challenges of rapid urbanization that we're faced with in South Africa today.